All right. So hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about tracking and crediting POIs as a judge. So this is obviously in relation to points of information, which could be any question, any statement, any remark that a team may want to make during a particular round or during a particular speech rather. And this is usually directed with the purpose of forwarding their case, criticizing the current argument or piece of analysis that a speaker is currently making, or to generally induce mistakes from the opponent, which is a very common um, intention of many points of information that might be raised, even if it is not necessarily always related to the case of a particular team. Because, again, what is a point of information? A point of information is meant to not just create an engagement, but also to just disrupt the speaker. Even just the act of raising a point of information is supposed to, for a variety of purposes, to make it more likely that the current speaker will get thrown off of their current rhythm. So, what I want to do here is acknowledge that for judges, this is an incredibly daunting task, right? You're already tracking the arguments, the responses. You're already trying to think about who's winning a round. But when there are points of information that are being raised and that you have to manage the room, and then you have to also encourage people to raise and take POIs accordingly, and on top of all of that, you have to listen to the POI, track that particular POI, and then incorporate that within the current notes structure that you've already had so far, you've already made so far throughout the entire round. And that is a difficult task, but it's not one that I think should be overstated as like something that you should take as like the most important function once a POI is raised. So don't underestimate a point of information, but don't also overestimate that this is like it should stop your critical thinking at this moment, and that you suspend your belief, and then whatever is said in the POI must be taken as gospel. Whatever is responded by the person must also be taken as like, like this transcript that you will use in a particular, like a testimony or hearing, for example. And then you'll be bound by what you stated and be bound by how you responded. Instead, consider a point of information as merely a moment of instantaneous engagement, which is that as opposed to relying on the structure of a speech, such as, oh, here are my responses, I'm responding here and there, this is my argument, I'm trying to compare it against the other team. What a POI does, and the reason why it's good for everyone in a round, especially the judge, is it puts upon the surface level, right? It makes it very forward that this is the engagement I want you to touch on right now. I want you to address this now, answer my question, respond to my remark, because the rules of British parliamentary state that you have to respond to what I'm saying right now. And so for a judge, for you, that should be a moment of clarity for you to situate that engagement within the other engagements that you're already addressing in your critical thinking process. So hopefully, for many POIs, this should make it easier for you to understand and situate that, oh, this is what's going on. It's just this idea among a set of ideas, but I'm gonna consider this particular engagement because this is a moment where there was an opportunity to directly engage from both sides. And so that's the mindset that you should have when you are provided with the blessing of people accepting and raising POIs and then willingly engaging with that in a particular round. And so the question now is, how should you track that moment? So for this particular brief video, I want to touch upon 4 particular steps. The first step is, did you catch the gist of the POI? Which is to say, don't just copy a word for word repetition of the POI, because you're not gonna get to do that anyways for any argument, any speech. You're not just a transcriber. You can't just write down every single word and then you suddenly you'll only start reading it properly at the end of the round, and then you'll spend 5 minutes preparing your oral adjudication based on the transcript. That's not really how it works. What instead you're supposed to do is, you listen intently for the POI, and then you ask, what are they asking? Right? What is the main function, like the main point that they are asking to be responded to on the part of the person who's raising a POI? But also, what contribution is specifically being made? Like, what is the main point? There are many points of information that are loaded with a lot of implicit assumptions and implicit claims, even accusations even, right? Like they always would say something like it's not symmetric, or in this example here, this argument on corruption is not comparative. So please engage us reasonably when we say that this policy mutually benefits both politicians and voters. Even if I don't tell you what that motion is, or the motion for where this POI might be raised, you should already know that, well, it seems that the gist of this POI is saying that I should not automatically credit the argument on corruption because corruption might exist on both sides. Perhaps there was some material that some speakers were giving on both sides as to why it is not comparative. I'm going to want to refer to that later on. But right now, I'm being instructed to look at what is mutually exclusive with respect to corruption. And so the claim that this speaker is trying to say is that you should engage us reasonably, not as uncharitably. You should be a little bit more charitable, and you should engage us on our specific argument, which says that this is a policy that will benefit both politicians and voters. And in my mind, I'm understanding that the gist of this POI states that it is questioning the mutual exclusivity of corruption, and it is saying that, well, even if there is some corruption, we're saying that it benefits politicians and voters, so it's still going to be an independent, good benefit on our side. And so, acknowledging that that was the main point of the POI is a very, very critical step in crediting that POI. The second step is to understand what is the primary function of the POI. A lot of points of information, because of the fact that it is constrained by 15 seconds, and that's a great thing, is that it encourages the speakers to really narrow down a particular issue, clash point, by setting up an engagement on a particular contribution, questioning a certain assumption, or putting to the front, right? Asking the speaker to address a certain question which will trap them to the case of the other side. And so there are some questions that, really do have an underlying trap, such as the question of who likely controls this narrative, if it were a glorification of motherhood or soldiers as heroes debate. And then someone asks the question, well, who likely controls this narrative? And so you should know as a judge that the reason why they are asking this question is because they want to address that some of the underlying impacts of whether the narrative is good or bad are contingent on who forwards the narrative, how do individuals get socially conditioned as a consequence of that narrative, and there will eventually be a very important engagement on whether or not it enables the worst forms of sexism or whatever, right? Whether it is tied with other narratives in that sense. So it's a very, very nice question that forces a team to specify what is the source of the narrative. Another POI that you might encounter would be like maybe a throwaway looking POI that tries to, you know, divert you towards defending something else that might be analogous or related to what you're currently defending. So you might ask the question, could you enlighten us on how the US invasion of Iraq went? And so if this were a motion, for example, on, let's say, intervention in a particular country, and then a team asks this POI, then you should know that they are inducing a comparison between the US invasion of Iraq, and that they will explain that there is some analogous relationship between this intervention that is currently being defended and the risks of this going haywire, as in the case of the US invasion of Iraq, and might be susceptible to capture by a particular military power. And of course, that's a very powerful POI if that analogy is very successful and that relationship is successful. And when someone is asked that POI directly, right, as a judge, you should be expecting that they should be responding by either providing reasons that, that it's not analogous, if we all agree that the US invasion of Iraq was bad, or they want to be very clear that it is, that even if there are some similarities, that there is a mutual exclusive difference with the motion that is being defended today, such as, for example, now we're defending multilateral intervention, which is why the over-reliance on a coalition of the willing by the US government would not be the same as it applies if it were led by multiple different military powers that are relatively stronger in leverage than they were back then in 2003. Another last example of a function that might not be easily discernible is if in the question of, if people are as rational as you say, then surely they would not fund ineffective charities. And of course, unpacking this question, once you listen to that POI, you should already be thinking, well, it seems that you're trying to spin an assumption or a characterization that is being provided by the speaker. And then the function of that POI is that you're trying to explain that it either doesn't reach their current conclusion or it reaches another conclusion that supports the other team, which is that, well, if you're saying that they're very rational, then of course they're gonna do this very well and they're gonna fund effective charities on our side, right? Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, these POIs don't in and of itself, right, constitute the positive argumentation for why the US invasion of Iraq is bad, or why the narrative is going to be controlled very badly, or why we will definitively fund effective charities. What it does is put in that significant point of doubt, forcing and inducing the speaker to currently, break apart the assumptions within that POI. And that's very, very important. I think that, for teams, right, that's beneficial because they are able to leverage off from that POI. But for a judge, when you're listening to that engagement, you already know that there are expectations on engagements that will ensue in the round. And that is something that you could leverage a lot when you are dealing with the oral adjudication, which is that, it was raised in a POI very early on in the debate, who controlled the narrative, and the team eventually characterized it in this particular way. There was this explanation that this example of the US invasion of Iraq was used very prominently in the round, where it could lead to abuses, and the underlying mechanism they provided later on in the round was this, but it was raised early on in the POI that they wanted to highlight that this was an analogous relationship, etc., etc. And so, you're already providing yourself with opportunities to think, okay, so what are the first fundamental groundwork stuff that I should be doing? How can I integrate this POI later on in this clash on rationality and this human decision making, etc., etc. Step 3. One other step that you can do, or the next step that you should be doing, rather, is asking the question, well, what happened in the immediate response? many speakers often make the faulty, or I would say the misguided mistake of just deferring the POI to saying that, oh, I'm gonna respond that later in my speech. Don't you wait, don't you worry. You wait, and all of that. And they might think that they are being very efficient because they're not gonna repeat that response later on. But usually this tends to manifest as, well, they will just sideline the POI and ignore it entirely, or they will just like subsume that POI within another set of responses later on without actually addressing the specific manifestation of the POI that was raised. And of course, as a judge, you should be very doubtful. You should be thinking, well, I was already provided with this opportunity to engage right now, but you didn't take opportunity of that moment. And so that's why taking note of the immediate response and wherever they will eventually try and flag that response is quite important for you as a judge. You really should be tracking that specific moment. You put a box for wherever that POI was laid out, and you immediately put down the answer while you were writing those notes, and it would usually manifest as follows. For example, if the POI was, your side cannot co-opt effective regulation, how else will you create legislation on deepfakes and fake news without intricate government knowledge on the development of AI? This knowledge is only possible if you have direct scrutiny with a private benefit corporation for affected stakeholders, which we proved in our case. So this is an example of a closing government. It's a closing government POI raised against an opening opposition or a closing opposition team in the round in the motion on OpenAI becoming a private benefit corporation, which is a very, very recent motion, very topical. And so, of course, you're not going to get to track all of that POI. You know that they're trying to highlight something about that direct scrutiny in a private benefit corporation. You know that you're tracking in the POI that they can't co-opt effective regulation. And so you know that the immediate response must be something related to effective regulation and direct scrutiny of a PBC. And then the answer you get is this. Notice the subtleties of the response, because no POI response will be perfect, and neither will the POI also be perfect. Neither will any response and any argument in a round also be particularly as comprehensive as you would desire it to be. And so we have to acknowledge those imperfections, and we have to highlight the limitations and the scope of the POI to the extent in which it is credible, and also the scope to which that answer is also credible. So now we go and evaluate it. The answer the speaker gives at closing opposition in response to the closing gov POI is this: governments still have strong incentives to regulate because of the national security risks of AI. Politicians aren't even experts in AI, so this knowledge isn't even that effective in the first place. Now, as a judge, if you've tracked this very well, and I'm assuming that right now this is very fresh in your mind. You've got this down. You listened to it properly. Everyone said this very clearly. And you have taken note that Op says that there is an incentive, a strong incentive because of national security risk. Gov says, no, but you can't co-opt regulation. And then Op furthermore says that, no, but politicians won't understand AI. And so the knowledge is not that effective. But what are they responding to? What are they not responding to? So this is a very simple way for you to address, right, the immediate response and whether it is effective or the extent to which it is effective. The response states that politicians can be misguided, that politicians can indeed misinterpret, and they will not benefit from this knowledge. And so it relatively touches on the relatively better case or the best case of the side, which says that, yeah, you might have direct scrutiny, but it doesn't mean that you could create effective regulation. But at least we have some strong incentives to regulate, so we have some regulation on our side. And so opposition is putting doubt on the quality of regulations that Gov can get, which is the underlying assumption of the POI, which is that direct scrutiny that comes from knowledge of a PBC allows us and facilitates some effective regulation. But at the same time, you should also acknowledge that, well, the answer of Op doesn't necessarily address the uniqueness of direct scrutiny with a private benefit corporation, and that there is intricate information on the development process of AI. And so now, right, like, we're never going to always evaluate around based on the vacuum of a POI engagement. But what we will do, what we should be doing, is we should be looking, well, what was the proof that they gave? What was the proof that they gave on the intricate knowledge on the development of AI? Is this going to be argued later on? Did they specifically explain that a PBC uniquely provides that information, which enables, the incentives of the government to get better and better at learning about the development of AI, thus creating more effective legislation? Is it really only about political will and politicians being engaged, or does it also involve other regulatory institutions and, the paperwork and documentation that is associated with, submitting your evaluation reports as a corporation? Now, that's not in the POI, right? None of that is in the POI, but you as a judge should already be noting that, okay, this is our leverage point. Our leverage point to noting this as a critical engagement in the round is assessing, did they prove this? Was this on the other side explained? That is this a necessary condition for abandoning the entire engagement on effective regulation or not, etc., etc. So these questions are very important, right? And that comes from acknowledging the limitations and the scope of an immediate response. And the last step that I would usually ask judges, and this is a very, very helpful discipline that I think a lot of judges should also develop, is the question of, well, what is the broader context of this POI engagement, right? You're not just evaluating the POI in a vacuum. I mean, of course, it's helpful to note that, did they respond to the POI? No, they didn't respond. They just ignored it. GG, right? Of course, that's going to be very unfortunate for the team that refuses to respond to a POI. That should come along with the consequences of not engaging with that POI, which might manifest as crediting that POI, crediting the argument associated with that POI, crediting the other assumptions related to the claims that are being made on that POI. And of course, you're going to do that with due scrutiny. But the way to do this properly, right, without just automatically making people win or lose, is to ask, well, what is the broader context of this POI engagement? A very good example, in my opinion, and I do consider this to be one of the greatest POIs in history in a world final. And this is the point of information that is raised by Will Jones at Deputy Leader of Opposition against Cormac Early at GovWhip. And this is a motion that this House would ban abortion. It's online. You can access this online and search it on YouTube, where closing government, because this is one of the closest world finals in history. It was like a 4-3 split for between closing gov and opening up. And closing gov was running the argument that not just that it's the defense of the right to life, but that it is that we do have a positive obligation to cater to an entity that is very vulnerable, which could include a fetus or the possibility of a human life being born in the future. And so they were using the analogy at closing gov on explaining that even if an entity or a person would inhibit the autonomy of other individuals, that is no reason to believe that we should necessarily eliminate that person because of the burden on someone else. And so closing gov says that is why we have an obligation in caretaking facilities to take care of the mentally ill, even if they might not necessarily be able to take care of themselves, but also precisely because they cannot take care of themselves. And that is why, because their well-being is contingent on the care from other individuals, then we have an approximate obligation to take care of them. And then this POI is raised by DLO. I think it's fantastic. The way it's executed was just brilliant, in my opinion. They said that a mentally ill person could be cared for by any number of people. it doesn't demand the total surrender of all autonomy and selfhood of one particular person, which is what your side subjects women to. And I think that if you just evaluated the POI on its own, and then of course, the response that Cormac gives in response to the POI is that I just don't think that being a mother is a total surrender of all autonomy and selfhood, which is a very good response, by the way. That's a very effective response, that it's not total surrender. You, as a judge, should take this as an opportunity to note that there is nuance provided by the POI. There's nuance provided by the POI against the analogy of the approximate obligations provided by Coast and Gov. And so you situate that within not just the broader argument of, oh no, I should just think about the argument on opening up about how it leads to undermining the autonomy of women in general. And then Coast and Gov runs an argument on approximate obligations for individuals that are, that are helpless. And then opening up says that no, but they are zombies, they are monsters, they undermine the autonomy of women. So now it's like, it sounds so hard for you to evaluate that particular contention on its own, right? Because it feels like one side is a woman's autonomy related issue, and the other side is an obligation to other entities related issue, which could both be positive obligations that we could also have, right? And so the POI engagement and answer should be situated in relation with both of those issues because they're tied to one another. That's what POIs do effectively. They don't isolate the issues alone. They tie in and make it easier for the judge to evaluate, well, why is this issue important in the first place? The issue of women's autonomy was important insofar as it is explained that it is a total surrender of autonomy, and that is what pregnancy is. That the state should legalize abortion as a consequence of that total surrender of autonomy. And so now you look for that evidence. You look at Gov's evidence to explain how this is not analogous, or how their overriding obligation on and their use of the analogy of the mentally ill person in a caretaking facility necessitates that this is an analogy that should be applied for the example of a mom and their fetus, right? So that's a very, very good one. I like this example a lot because it does put to the forefront those particular two issues that you have to, as a judge, consider. Because you wouldn't consider that, unless you are being very diligent by tracking these engagements that only uniquely happen, or at least I think they happen best when POIs are, they make it easier for you, is what I'm saying. That rather than going through the critical thinking process of, okay, so how did they implicitly respond to this, blah, blah, blah. Now you have the explicit material that is available to you, thereby allowing you to relate that with other information that was provided during a round. Okay, fantastic. So that's pretty much it. All I wanted to do in this video was just cover how do we look at POIs, how do we track them, how do we credit them. This is always going to be a difficult task, but the bottom line always is a point of information is a unique facet of debating that makes it easier for everyone. It makes it easier for the judge to notice some responses over others. It makes it easier for the teams to leverage on those points of information and those responses. And it also makes it more engaging, which is beneficial for everyone in the round as well. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Good luck and have fun whenever you listen to that moment of confusion, that moment of disruption in a particular round. All right, see you guys. Bye-bye.